The GeekWire podcast was kind enough to have me on their show to talk about some various subjects that I've discussed on my own podcast. So we're republishing that episode today, and we'll be back to our regularly scheduled programming on Monday. Thanks.
Well, let's just jump in.
Sure.
I'm talking with Jeff Meyerson. He is the host of a great show called Software Engineering Daily. If you want to know what's going on in the world of software engineering, what's on the minds of some of the key software engineers around the region and the nation, really, you talk with folks all over the place. It's a great show to tune into. So thanks for being here, Jeff.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of GeekWire.
Just as background, tell us how you got into the business of hosting a daily software engineering podcast.
Sure. Okay. So there's two sides of it. One side is the software engineering side. I studied computer science at University of Texas. And while I was going to school, I was doing all these internships. And when I would commute between these internships and my school, I would always listen to this show called Software Engineering Radio, which is, so I can definitely plug them. I'm a huge fan of Software Engineering Radio. It's a super highly technical software podcast. And I would listen to it and understand about 5% of it. And I would listen to these episodes over and over and over again. And I ended up learning more from those podcasts than I did from a lot of my classes and even from some of my internships. And eventually, during my senior year, I emailed the guy that's in charge of it and I said, hey, can I get involved? And so I got involved. So I started doing episodes for Software Engineering Radio. So that's kind of the podcasting side of it. The other side of it is the actual engineering side of it, which is me just doing various engineering jobs over the past, I guess I started doing internships like 4 or 5 years ago and then eventually transitioned into full-time work. And none of the jobs that I had were fulfilling to me. So eventually I was just looking for a way to start something I can do myself. And at that point, I had been doing a lot of podcasting. I started a couple other podcasts aside from Software Engineering Radio, and I had done, over 100 hours of software of just podcasting in general. And I had learned enough about software, and I knew enough about the market of software podcasts to know that there was a gap in the market. So I decided to start Software Engineering Daily.
That's great. How long ago did you start it?
It was about 4 months.
Yeah, so you're still very, very early in the process, although you've got some great content. You talk with leaders in the field in areas that a lot of software engineers want to know about.
Yeah.
What are the main issues that are on the minds of the people you talk with, software engineers out there, whether it's issues with the platforms they're using, transitions in the types of developer tools, or even bigger issues like in the job market and poaching of employees? What are the biggies that they always tend to come up? Yeah,
so I would say that finding a job that you really enjoy is truly the biggest issue. That was certainly my biggest issue, and I think it's something that underpins a lot of the problems that other engineers have in their job. Whether that problem is they're not a good fit at the company because of the technologies that the company uses, or they're not a good cultural fit. I think so that's from the employment standpoint. From the engineering standpoint, there's the thing of if you're a front-end developer, front-end web development is moving so quickly. It's really hard to keep up with what are the latest technologies. What are the technologies you should be familiar with? Like 3 or 4 years ago, Ruby on Rails was like the thing to know. Now it's Node.js and JavaScript technologies and JavaScript everywhere. And even within that, there's subsections. I mean, we've moved from Angular being the predominant. Angular is Google's front-end JavaScript framework. We've moved from that being the most popular, the most widely accepted front-end JavaScript framework to this new thing from Facebook called React. And it's like these things are like totally incompatible technologies. So if you move from a job that uses Angular to a job that uses React, you have to learn this whole new technology. And for some people, that's great. For other people, that's an issue. And then there's the back end side of things.
Databases
and just being I mean, the whole quote unquote big data
Right.
world, like that's like a new job title. If you're there's this new job role called data engineer, which used to get wrapped up into the role of data scientist, but data scientist has become kind of disjoint from data engineer. Data engineer is now this person that wires together the Hadoop stack, the Spark, the Kafka. These are all these Apache open source projects that take all this plumbing to set up. And everybody needs a data engineer if you want a big data stack. So there's that's a problem that exists both in hiring and if you're an employee at one of these companies and you see the company suffering because you don't have a good data pipeline, maybe you should build that data pipeline. And then that's a huge challenge to learn that new technology.
So in all of these things, like for example, when you're talking about building a data pipeline, how much is just out there to be found and brought in, like libraries that you can bring in to create the project you're doing versus things that you have to create from scratch? Because it seems like it's gone in the direction of a lot of stuff being able to be repurposed from open source projects and a lot of the heavy lifting is done for you by these cloud platforms. What are you seeing along those lines?
Well, it's interesting. The most common business model for in the open source world, there's a business model that happens frequently. And the first company that really did this, I think, was Red Hat. And Red Hat had the model where they would, as I understand, they open sourced their operating system as a Linux distribution, and they would make money by providing services around that operating system.
Right.
You buy Red Hat for your corporation. And if something's going wrong, you can always call Red Hat, and they'll come and help you for a price.
This was Novell's business model for many years, if I remember correctly.
Oh, okay. I don't know. That's a little before my time, but this has been a model that's been kind of replicated in companies like Cloudera, in companies like Confluent, where they take an open source technology, they build a company around it, and you can either roll your own version of the service like Kafka or Hadoop, or you can pay one of these companies to build it for you.
Right.
So it's a kind of a combination of open source and companies that will manage the open source for you.
Right. Okay. So if you were just coming out of college now, knowing all the tools and platforms and everything that you talk about with people every day, is there one or two or three that you would really focus on? I know you mentioned React before from Facebook.
Yeah. If you're front end, React for sure. Like React and just Node.js and being able to build JavaScript technologies. If you're a data scientist, Apache Spark. But I haven't actually worked with Spark, but my understanding is that it's kind of a layer that fits under SQL. And then if you're going to be a back-end, quote-unquote back-end developer, I guess it's still Java. I think you still want to know Java, although really you can't go wrong just investing in JavaScript.
So you mentioned React. Let's talk about that.
Sure.
You had our whole React week, and that's one of the things that I like about what you do is you have themed weeks where you have these fundamental questions at the beginning, then you bring in a series of guests, one each day. You sort of have this common thread of the fundamental questions, and then at the end you have the fundamental answers, and it's actually a really nice full circle, and you have a closed loop there.
Yeah.
To use a software development term.
Yeah. To be honest, like I bit off more than I can chew with the whole fundamental questions and fundamental answers thing, because like I would write these questions at the beginning of the week, and then at the end of the week I would have to write fundamental answers, and it would be this long article that would be hanging over my head. And so I've kind of moved away from that. We're still doing themes, but it's just there's enough work involved in kind of getting a daily episode out that we are choking on the themes a little bit. But in terms of the React week, it was really interesting. Facebook developers were really open to talking to us.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it was really cool. Like a lot of other companies will put up PR walls between their developers. Right. But the Facebook guys were just like super nice and welcoming. And
what does that say about the company or about its developers?
You know, I mean, I talked to some of them about this. I was like, is this a reflection of the social aspect of the company? Does this bleed into your development process? I'm not sure how much of that holds water, but definitely it's there is an increased openness that's correlated with their movement towards open source. So like prior to a couple years ago, I guess when they started to open source React and some other technologies, there was a reticence to do open source within Facebook. But after they open sourced React, the open source community got really fell in love with Facebook, and I think the Facebook developers started communicating more with the open source community, and I think that probably extrapolated to the reporting aspect of it.
So did React start as an internal tool that Facebook used to build its own apps?
Yes.
That's the gist.
Yes.
And we're talking about the user interface here, the front end.
Yes. It's a tool for building user interfaces, basically, or at least that's how it's kind of started out, and then they fleshed out all this other stuff around it.
What makes it so interesting or good?
Well, one thing that's interesting is it has this markup called JSX that looks really ugly the first time you look at it.
Like when you're looking at the code?
When you're looking at the code, it just looks hideous because it looks like you mash together JavaScript and HTML. And developers are used to kind of having these things cleanly partitioned from one another, and so yeah, I mean, what makes it so good is it has a one-way data flow. It's kind of hard to explain that without like a technical.
No, go for it.
Okay, well, so there's typically in JavaScript frameworks you have a two-way data binding where the update if you have data that gets updated in the database and you want that to be reflected on the front end, doing that updating is kind of complicated and slow and memory intensive. But this one-way data binding that React kind of invented with this thing called the virtual DOM, which is like you have the DOM, which represents your web page, and you have another thing called the virtual DOM, which represents kind of the updates that have been made to your web page since the page has been initially rendered. And these two things can sync together. And the way that they sync together is just this really nice algorithm, this DOM diffing algorithm that Facebook invented with some really powerful computer science techniques that they invented just through sheer iteration. It really shows the technical prowess of the Facebook team.
So in the past, the tendency of a lot of companies having made those kinds of innovations would be, hey, let's keep this to ourselves as our own competitive advantage. What does it say about the world of software development and maybe about Facebook in particular that they decided to open source the technology?
Yeah, I think we're entering this age of collaboration where companies are realizing that you can't have this separation of church and state. You kind of have to have this. You have to more aggressively figure out how to collaborate with other companies and collaborate with other developers, and really open yourself up, because there's so many other business opportunities you can have other than like making your software super proprietary and super protected. So, I mean, like even Microsoft, which you would think of as anathema to this idea. The very first interview I did for Software Engineering Daily was with the guy a guy who does TypeScript. So TypeScript is like an open source technology. Well, they made it open source very deliberately, and I mean, Microsoft is shipping, they ship Linux through Azure. They probably have. I mean, I'm sure they have more Azure machines that are Linux than are Windows. I don't think anybody spins up a Windows instance on Azure. And so that says something. It's like Microsoft is leveraging open source, so that gives them all the more reason to put other kinds of investments into it. So
yeah, they've open sourced key elements of .NET, their developer platform. I mean,
this is exactly right.
When that happened last year, I mean, I wrote like a New York Post style headline. I think it was like Microsoft shocker. I mean, because to your point, if you look 10 years ago, under the Steve Ballmer regime, that never would have happened.
What was the ethos like at Microsoft back then? That like if somebody would have come to the table and said, "Hey, I think we should open source this technology," how would Microsoft have?
If I'm not mistaken, I think Steve Ballmer at one point called Linux a cancer. So the ethos was very much about intellectual property protection and Microsoft building up its patent portfolio and well, even there's still an element of that there. They just only recently settled that long-running patent dispute with Google over the Android technology,
right,
where they were going after all of the individual handset vendors, the mobile phone vendors that were using Android. And, frankly, Microsoft for many quarters now has been getting more revenue from patent licensing from Android devices than it makes on actual real licensing of its Windows Phone devices, of the Windows Phone software. So
is one side of that where because I remember I was trying to read about the business strategy of Google buying Motorola, or Google bought Motorola, right?
And then sold them. And then
sold
spun
them.
them off
But didn't
again.
they buy them just so they could like temporarily have some patent stuff?
There was a big patent element to it.
What was the story there?
Motorola had tons and tons of smartphone-related, H.264 and also Wi-Fi protocol standard essential patents, and that was really the crux of one of the biggest disputes with Microsoft. I think things are just changing. I think Microsoft is recognizing a lot of the things you're talking about. You don't necessarily innovate or you don't protect the development technology. It's more what you can do creatively on top of that. And so I think that's really the broader trend that's happening here. But Microsoft I've covered them since 2002, and it's just amazing how there are a lot of things that are still the same there. But so much has changed in terms of the company's outlook and the way that it interacts with the rest of the industry.
So when those giant revenue numbers came out recently for the Azure stuff, I know that I remember reading the combined market cap of Google, Amazon, Microsoft went up $100 billion recently, like just on one day, I think, on the day when they all announced.
Right. They all did very well in the market that day, yeah.
Do you know what percentage of that was Azure?
I'd have to go back and look at the financials. I know that I wrote about it. It's hard to keep it in my head exactly what exactly it was, but it's certainly growing, and their commercial cloud business, as they call it, has been doing very well. The issue is that Microsoft is shifting away from traditional software licensing revenue. And if you look at something like Office 365, just on the application side, they aren't making nearly as much on, if I understand correctly, per user on Office 365. They're not making as much as they would with a standard licensing fee in the past. For example, because they're offering it for free on iOS and Android, the core editing functionalities, and you can get the advanced features by paying for a subscription. But yeah, it's really changed. It's really changed. Another thing that you do, so occasionally you break out of just talking about the technical details. And one of my favorite interviews that you did was with two teenagers who make a piece of software called the Crocodile Browser.
Yeah.
And I'll link to that from the show notes on this episode. People definitely need to check it out. But tell us about these kids, where they're from and what they do.
So this is Anesi and Osine Ikianosime. These are...
I can tell you practiced that.
I did practice it some, but also it's really interesting. This is one of the benefits of doing this podcast is I've made really good friends with them. So these are these Nigerian teenagers. And this is you would not expect a random guy in Seattle to have befriended a pair of Nigerian teenagers, but in actuality, I've become really good friends with them, and we talk on a daily basis about technical stuff.
Really?
Their favorite podcast is A16Z.
From Andreessen Horowitz.
Andreessen Horowitz. I'm I can relate to that. I love the Andreessen Horowitz podcast. So we were consuming the same media. But anyway, the story there is I initially contacted them to do a podcast because they created this browser, this fast browser called Crocodile Browser. I encourage Android users to check it out. I was fascinated not only by the technology itself because who writes a browser? That's cool. But I was fascinated by the fact that these are Nigerian teenagers, and I have no idea how software development takes place in Nigeria. As it turns out, it takes place just like it would take place in America, pretty much. I mean, minimum viable product, aggressive iteration, the same kind of communication and source control and experimentation. And I was really struck by how similar I felt to them when I was talking to them. I didn't feel like there was this like vast cultural boundary between us. So yeah.
And it speaks to the way the world is changing. I mean, you've got another hundreds of millions of additional people coming online, especially over the next decade. And it seems like this is the type of thing that is just going to continue to happen. Not only are people who are already online and maybe existing software developers able to go and probably work from wherever they want long term, but in developing countries, there's a whole new set, not only of internet users, but of technology innovators coming online. Well, this gets to another thing, and we were talking in advance a little bit about what we wanted to talk about on this show. And one of the things that you said that really struck me was that there's this myth that software developers are replaceable cogs. And you look at software developers and engineers more fundamentally as artists. Talk to me more about that and share your perspective on that.
Sure. I would say this is probably largely informed by my experience when I was studying computer science. And in college, I was also writing a lot of music. And I would see a lot of parallels between writing music and engineering software. And plenty of people. This is not a new, not a new realization. Plenty of people have made that observation, but I was just seeing it so up close. And then I also, my proudest achievement when I was in school, I did some internships, but I wrote this game with a couple friends that I was never thinking of it from the standpoint of monetization or anything, and it didn't turn into anything business-like, but it was the best piece of engineering that I've made probably, and it just made me realize that the people who to get the best work out of yourself, you have to be thinking from an artistic perspective. So that makes sense to make your North Star as an engineer some sort of artistic goal, because that's the only way where you're going to do your best work.
How would you define an artistic goal in that context versus something that's non-artistic?
Well, something that's non-artistic is like you show up at your job and you ask your boss, "What do I do?" That's the equivalent of somebody with Andy Warhol's talent just going and working as a servile advertising person. But the contrary would be like Andy Warhol knows he's a great artist, and he does some. I don't know if this is actually what happened. I'm pretty sure this is not all what happened. But if he just started painting Campbell's soup cans and then came to Campbell's and said, "Hey, I have painted this for you.
Right.
I am doing viral marketing. How much are you going to pay me for this?" And they would pay him a ton. And so it's that sort of. I think I would say our artistry goes hand in hand with. What people would call entrepreneurship, maybe, or right. But really, it's this this ability to create something yourself, and to sort of the Steve Jobs parlance is like put a dent in the universe.
Right. So how much do software developers that you talk to share that view that software engineering as artistry?
Well, one of my favorite questions to ask at the end of an interview is software engineering more of an art or a science? And it's really interesting. Like yesterday or a couple of days ago, I was interviewing the creator of Erlang, and Erlang is this really important language. WhatsApp was built on Erlang. So, $19 billion company built on Erlang. Facebook Messenger is built on Erlang. Many communication platforms are built using Erlang. He said he thought software engineering was more of an art. We talked about the atmosphere of software development at Ericsson, where Erlang was developed, and many people shared his view that at least one other guy shared. So one other important engineer shared his view. To the contrary, I interviewed a guy who created a robotics company in India, and he said that software engineering was much more of a science. So, and this is this company, Gray Orange Robotics. This I think it's $1 billion company. Maybe it's not $1 billion company. I don't know, but it's certainly they're doing crazy stuff, and he sees it as a science. So. But I would say that the vast majority of people see programming more as a science. But by the same token, I generally feel a little depressed or let down when I'm talking to most of my friends who are software engineers, because most of them they earn astronomical amounts of money and then they go home and play video games. And it's really depressing to me, because programming is this amazing tool you have and nobody's utilizing it.
Yeah, you can conjure things out of thin air.
Yeah.
And go out and change the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, boy, a lot of times we'll talk to, and John Cook, my colleague, just talked to a bunch of high school students this past week. And I think a lot of the things that we say to them are, hey, go in, at least look, well, first off, learn math and science and pay attention to those topics in class. At least give yourself a chance to consider going into computer science or software development, not only for the economic reasons, but for the chance to change the world.
Yeah.
I mean, it just seems like it's kind of a no-brainer to at least consider it.
How long have we had books? We've had books a really long time. How long have we had painting? We've had painting a really long time. These other artistic mediums, they've been explored. I mean, it's not to say there's not plenty more to do. There's plenty more to do with painting. There's plenty more to do with books, but there's a lot more to be done in software. I mean, software is younger, and there's the scope of software is like bigger than the scope of painting or book writing. So it's like, if you want an easy route to expressing yourself in a way that has not been expressed before, just go to programming.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, you have some of your standard questions. We have some of our standard questions too. So let me throw them at you. Okay. If you had to choose Mac, PC, or Linux?
Mac.
Mac. And why?
Because I make that choice every day. So I can just say empirically.
What about Mac are you drawn to?
It's just the out-of-the-box design niceness.
So it's more about the hardware?
No. I mean, out of the box, the OS does everything I want it to do.
Got it.
And also, it's kind of a wisdom of the crowds thing where the most people are using it, so the software on it, I think, is the nicest. And also, you get this interesting effect where the highest income people are buying Macs, so people are writing software for the highest income people. Therefore, it's frequently the best software.
Yeah. Okay. Kirk, Picard, or Janeway? And it's okay to say you're not a Star Trek fan.
Yeah, it's not that I'm not a fan. I just don't watch a lot of TV.
Yeah.
Like, when I find myself watching TV, I frequently love it. I would say Picard because he's the one I recognize.
Yeah. Okay, good.
I remember Kirk was in a time travel movie, and he was riding a horse at some point. That's all I remember about him.
Okay. Transporter, time machine, or cloak of invisibility?
Time machine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why a time machine?
Well, I mean, time machine seems like a superset of transporter.
Yes.
Maybe not. Okay,
no,
so you
no.
transport, you take the time machine back to the exact same place in space.
Right, exactly. I love how you get analytical about this. This is good. Most people just go for one. Most people think Harry Potter, cloak of invisibility.
No, that's kind of creepy. Who needs cloak of invisibility?
Yeah, that is true. That's kind of like the stalker's choice, isn't it?
Yeah.
It was useful for Harry.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like in high school I could have used the cloak of visibility.
Yes.
Nobody noticed me.
Exactly. So time machine is your pick.
Probably,
go back to different eras. And then if someone gave me $1 million, someone gave me $1 million to launch a startup, we probably need to jack up the amount on this question. But I would fill in that blank.
I've got a couple like small software ideas, but I would do a music company.
Really? And you mentioned that earlier. So do you play a musical instrument?
Yeah, the computer is basically my instrument. I mean,
Yeah.
I play keyboard and guitar and some drums too, but mostly I'm just programming synthesizers and sound processing and stuff.
There's a great app that I love to use. In fact, I'll make a point of using one of the music pieces of music that I created. It's called Figure for iOS. I think it might be on Android too.
Oh.
And it's great. It's like a drum machine and synthesizer on steroids. You basically create patterns that repeat, and it's all very mathematical.
Sure.
And I love it. You should check it out.
Absolutely.
Figure is the name of it.
Well, so here's the thing I think about electronic music that I think is weird. We have a lot of electronic musicians that are extremely successful as solo artists. Like if you think about the top electronic musicians, a lot of times they're solo artists. Skrillex, Diplo, even like a group like Swedish House Mafia is like 3 people. That's about as big as it gets for like electronic music acts. So what's really interesting to me is like I want to figure out a way that electronic musicians can collaborate more, because like the best software we see developed has lots and lots and lots of collaborators. So like how do you get that scale with electronic music?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So I'm not sure how you get there, but like there's a company called Splice that's kind of working on this problem, and I think it's just a really hard problem. It's something that's interesting to me.
Yeah. So that would be your $1 million startup idea.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. Very cool. Good. So just as we round up here, upcoming topics that you're looking forward to exploring on Software Engineering Daily?
Apache Spark.
Yep.
Is a big one.
And for people who don't know what Apache Spark is.
Yeah, so it's in-memory data processing, typically used with the Hadoop platform. That still probably means nothing.
So it's super efficient data processing because it's not going back to the hard drive, basically. Is that a no?
I don't know. That's
okay. Well, we're going to find out. We're going to find out on one of your upcoming episodes. That's great.
Other topics. Right now, we're doing a week of coding bootcamp episodes, which is like really interesting. All these alternative ways of learning programming outside of the ivory tower computer science realm. I would love to do a week of shows on containers. And if anybody's listening and they have ideas for stuff that they want to hear about in the software engineering world, like please send me.
So what's the best way to get in touch with you? softwareengineeringdaily@gmail.com or www.softwareengineeringdaily.com. It's a really long URL. I recognize you can just say softwareengineeringdaily.com.
Yeah.
You don't have to say the www.
Oh, okay, that's true.
I'm actually on your site right now. There's no www.
http://
That's right. Open up your terminal window and here's where you type the code to reach my website.
Yeah.
Well, Jeff Meyerson, thank you very much for being
Todd,
on.
It's been awesome.
All right, so that is Jeff Meyerson. He is at Software Engineering Daily. He's the host of a great daily podcast there. You can check him out at softwareengineeringdaily.com. We'll talk to you next time on GeekWire. Thanks for listening, everybody.